remove all of the assumptions, all of the everything that the beliefs, everything that we think we know, and we approach a situation with pure adaptability in mind, we get back to the base, the core structure of what we are, which is supreme adaptability wrapped in consciousness, then that's true genius, I think.
Welcome to the Enso Project. This is a podcast for people engaging in the never-ending process of expansion and growth. So the purpose of this podcast is to expand and grow through awareness, introspection, and stillness. We fundamentally understand that relative to all there is to know, we know relatively nothing. So with this in mind, we will consider and reconsider interesting perspectives, ideologies, and strategies for the purpose of self-actualization. Josiah, my man.
What's up?
How's it going?
All right.
Good. Hey, what are we talking about today?
We're talking about being a bad scientist with respect to events in our life, results in our life, and invariably the beliefs that we validate or create by being a poor scientist.
I like it. So this concept is coming from the idea that we're constantly forming hypotheses and testing those and drawing conclusions from our experiments, right?
Mm-hmm.
However, many of us, and I fall into this category many times over in my life, we failed to enact the scientific method. We've been very, very bad scientists, and we've drawn conclusions based off of really limited information, poor sample sizes, not enough iterations, no replication, nothing that we would expect for like a rigorous scientific experiment. So, and I think it's so interesting how these beliefs then go on to shape our lives, because they're just beneath the surface of the water. So we can't really see them, but they're impacting us constantly. So throw you into the fire, put you on the spot, and ask you, are there any like super immediate examples that come to mind of where you think people fall into this trap of being a bad scientist?
Yeah, I think frequent behavior based on assumptions. Assumption is probably a conclusion that's made from, I don't think it's just a conclusion that's made from an event. And I think maybe we were to do ourselves a disservice is whenever we don't investigate the facts, when we don't, like we talked about earlier, having neutral thinking, where we're just looking at what is, and then examining that and asking ourselves, what could be. And I think the operative word is could leading to possibility. There's no assumption there because it's relatively open-ended. It's not finite. And I think assumptions in a lot of cases, at least in my experience, are kind of matter of fact.
Because I said so.
Well, yes, also because it happened, right? So we look at something and we say, that happened, therefore this.
Right, must happen.
Or therefore this was the intention.
Right.
And we don't really ask about the intention, right?
Yeah.
So I think probably the most common example is our existence. We exist and we make up all these reasons why we exist, but no one really knows, right?
Right.
Because we didn't put ourselves here as far as we know. We're not responsible for the existence. So when we make an assumption and then, off of an event or what is, and we say, hey, here's the intention behind it, here's the reason, here's the rationale behind it, look out.
Gosh, bad science right there, for sure. I'm going to tee up a softball for you now, and that's the assumption that we make that more effort is always the answer. That if there's a problem with the outcome, there must be an issue with the level of effort. What would you say about that hypothesis or that conclusion?
I would say it's built off of an assumption. It is, I think it's a relatively healthy assumption in most cases, right? Effort's not always a bad thing, but it can work, negative thing. It can work against you. But I think in a lot of ways, when that assumption is made, someone's not aware of the iterative process that is, underlying, or it is driving a thing, right? So
Okay.
I think process is more important than effort relative to results.
And process here is kind of like a proxy for your strategy or your tactics, just the how, not necessarily the what.
Yeah, it's the how the results came to be, because effort may be one of 8 components,
Mm-hmm. Right.
right? And so when, let's say it is someone who's observing it and they say, oh, they didn't win because they didn't give enough effort, right? Armchair quarterbacking, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Man, the Dallas Cowboys, they are terrible because, Dak Prescott, he threw, an interception, and he is terrible. He shouldn't be paid that much money. That is like, you're looking at the event, you're looking at the result, and then you're saying it's a matter of effort. Well, maybe he didn't read the coverage well, or maybe he had never seen that on film,
Right.
or maybe he did see that on film, but his process of study wasn't as good as it could have been, right?
Maybe he was a bad scientist.
Or maybe he was a bad scientist, right? Yeah, so I just think typically we make that assumption. We're not aware of process and the role it plays in the overall results that we want.
Yeah. I'm just thinking, like, from a tactical perspective, you can, if you try to cut down a tree with a sledgehammer, you could eventually cut down that tree. It would be a very long, very effortful process.
Right.
And in a sense, yes, if you apply more effort over time, you could be successful.
Mm-hmm.
But I definitely don't see it as the answer. And I think most people would not see applying more effort as the answer. This is a really obvious example because we have such a thing as an axe or a chainsaw, even better, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of what I'm getting at is I think there are methods in the world for everything that can feel effortless in a sense and produce the same result. However, we oftentimes aren't aware. We're not aware of those methods. We haven't gone through enough experimentation to make the discovery of this method where we can suddenly act in a way that might appear to others as effortless.
Right.
Because it's procuring that outcome in a really expedient and a not very effortful way. So I don't know. What do you think about that concept?
No, I agree, and that's what I mean by having a healthy understanding of the process, right? So how do we create the results we want? Someone has to look at that iterative underlying process that's happening and say, I think they have the handle right, but there must be something else that needs to go on top of the handle to actually chop the tree down in less time.
Like changing the sledgehammer to an axe.
Right. And I think, I agree, we're not aware enough. And I actually think it takes the adequate experience. So there could be 10 to 15 people, it could be entire generations in a family that are just sledgehammering away at, let's say, marriage, right?
Right.
And they're giving it their best effort, and no one is getting the results that they intend. And then
they're getting a result, right? Just the wrong one.
Just the wrong,
not the one they want.
Right.
Yeah.
And then there's someone that comes along and they look at it. They're in the family. They observe it. They observe the underlying iterative process, and they say, "Oh, wait, they're missing a component. You know, grandma and grandpa were missing a component.
Right.
Dad and mom were missing this component. My aunt and uncle were missing that component, or my uncle and uncle were missing this component." And they get all 8 from analyzing that iterative process and come up with their own, right, or modify it. And then that leads to the results that they want down the road. So I agree. There has to be some sort of observation or analysis, and then there has to be an awareness and a belief that it can be done. There's just a different way to do it. And then I think those individuals who ultimately go on to do that thing, whatever it is, to innovate or iterate in a different way, a more effective way, their experience and their observations are unique, but they aren't necessarily any different from any other person who has that obstacle in their way or has that intention for the result that they want.
So we've stumbled upon the topic of belief, which I'm glad that we landed here, because I think this is, if you believe that the only way to chop down the tree is with a sledgehammer, then you're very unlikely to ever try any different method, right? So I'm curious about the functionality of the mechanism of holding closely to this belief of there is always a better way. I think this might be a Thomas Edison quote. I'm gonna feel really bad if it's Thomas Jefferson instead, but
I wouldn't. I'd feel like Thomas Jefferson. Hey, he did a good job of finding a better way. Wrote the Constitution.
Right. No, anyways, I think when we make this assumptions, right? Assumptions can hurt us or they can help us, but when we make the assumption that there is always a better way and it's waiting in the wings, waiting to be found and leveraged, and that this new paradigm, this new way of doing or being will make the old one obsolete in such a way that the same function now appears effortless relative to what our past was, which I think it's pretty easy to make the case for someone using a chainsaw to cut down a tree. And I really, for all of our sustainability-minded, earth-loving listeners out there, I'm sorry that we're using this example. It was just out of convenience. I love trees. But
I tried to shift to marriage.
You did, but I just keep bringing us back to these poor trees. So using a chainsaw to cut down a tree would appear totally effortless relative to using a sledgehammer.
Right.
So what other opportunities are there in our lives if we're willing to put in the effort required to practice good science, good experimentation? What might we discover?
Well, what might we discover? That's yet to be seen. I think the most important question is how much time will we save ourselves?
Oh my gosh.
How will we optimize our existence? So, for example, it took a different mindset for someone to put as much effort into creating a chainsaw. They created a chainsaw. They created a new process of cutting down a tree, right? Still cutting down trees. Right. Trees aren't, made of metal now. They're still made of wood. They still grew the same way out of the ground, right? So someone just came along and iterated on the sledgehammer, the saw, the axe, now mechanized it, chainsaw, right? And I think with each one of those iterations and developing that thing, whatever that process, whatever that is, it took just as much effort, if not more, than someone trying to knock a tree down with a sledgehammer, right? Same amount of effort, in my opinion. Just deployed in a different, right? Okay. Now, whenever they cut the tree down, what's really happening is they're saving time,
right,
and invariably effort,
okay,
right, for everyone else.
A bit tangential, perhaps, but the act of innovation, of designing a new instrument that's going to make an old way obsolete, I think that there is a lot of intrinsic value in that. I know a lot of people derive a sense of meaning and purpose and satisfaction from that type of work, right? So that's engaging, it's compelling. And yes, the same could be said in some circumstances about cutting down a tree with a sledgehammer. I just think it's much fewer and further between, right? It feels mundane, monotonous, and pointless. And work, I strongly suspect that work exists to serve man, that man does not exist for the purpose of working, but that we can and often do derive this deep sense of meaning and purpose and fulfillment from our work. And I think that innovation is really at the forefront of that. It's kind of the pinnacle of what it means to have success at work, is to create something that is so effective and so functional that we transcend to another plane or another way of being and doing.
Yeah, so that's what I was saying about the mindset, right? So the difference between somebody that was trying to knock down the tree with the sledgehammer, yes, they're going to be ultimately saving time. But let's say that, we go back and, 200 years, and we hand that person a chainsaw. They're probably going to go insane because it's too much it's too big of a leap. Right? So where their mind was. And that's why I'm saying, like, I think, sure, we can innovate, but we're not making one thing obsolete, in my opinion. We're really just we're making it irrelevant for the time.
Yeah.
Now, let's say that, there's no longer any gas to power these, chainsaws. Are no longer any chains, right?
Right.
Well, then the chainsaw is no longer relevant. And then the previous method may now become relevant, right? So then at that point, it's not that the other thing was obsolete. It just simply means that it had no utility or had no purpose in that time.
You've really piqued my curiosity when you're talking about giving a chainsaw to somebody, 200 years in the past.
Yes, along that vein, right? What happens when all the gas runs out or there's no change for chainsaws?
Yeah.
The people that were using chainsaws, what happens now when they have to go back or go to something that they had never used before?
Yeah.
Their minds, I'm not saying it will go insane, but they're going to have to fundamentally change how they view the process of chopping down trees, and that may impact them mentally, right?
I suspect it will.
Yeah.
I also think that it could be a tremendous opportunity to innovate again. The one of the interesting things I learned about Google and Google X, which is like I think they call their moonshot division, where they're not trying to improve something by a small margin, make it, 10 to 15% better or more effective. They're trying to 10x it.
Yeah.
So whenever you're trying to 10x something, you have to rid yourself of all of those assumptions, or at least this is the model that Google works under. So say we've reached the pinnacle of tree chopping, which is the chainsaw. Again, sorry, trees.
That would be no trees.
Well, no, I'm just saying, not that we want to cut them all
No,
down, but when one needs to be cut down, then we use a chainsaw. But if we run out of materials to make chainsaws, or somehow that technology is no longer feasible for us, we're back to square one, and square one is a clean slate. It's a really interesting place to be. So there's opportunity there. And then last thing I want to say about what you were talking about earlier with, giving a chainsaw to, let's really make this wild. Like, we give a chainsaw to a Neanderthal.
Right.
And they're like, what is this? It's so bizarre. It's so outside of their level of understanding.
Mm-hmm.
But then I also think about, what about a 5-year-old with a television?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just the complexity of that technology and the total inability at that point in time to grasp how this is possible, but the apparent complete lack of a need to understand how it works.
Mm-hmm.
And a simple fascination. I mean, you've seen 5-year-olds glued to a TV screen, right? It's a very common way to entertain your 5-year-old.
Right.
So I don't know. I think that's so interesting. Maybe sometimes we don't really need to know how it works to leverage it.
Well, perhaps I would say that it's been my observation that I think we talked about this a while ago, that let's say the 5-year-old, right?
Yeah.
If we observe another person using a thing, or if that person's attention is important to us or them as a 5-year-old, and they see the interest that person has with that particular object, then whoever's observing is going to be much more likely to pick up that skill or learn it or be interested in it. Mm. Here's a great example. Tiger Woods is a genius. He only played golf because his father was interested in playing golf. And I'm quoting a documentary, but his father was interested in playing golf, and he observed his father playing golf, and he picked up on things as a baby, is a prodigy, right? But let's say that his father was playing piano, or he was a chef, right? Like, whatever it is, I do think he would have gravitated towards that, and he would have picked that up a lot faster. So I think the TV example of 5-year-old or the chainsaw to the Neanderthal, if there's a relationship component to it, they're much more likely to kind of pick up on the utility of that particular object and want to use it. Okay,
so many interesting things going on here. This might be the most meandering podcast we have recorded thus far.
We're being good scientists.
We're trying.
We should go work for Google.
Being brave in the attempt. Yeah. So I want to start this off with, we have a 5-year-old with a chainsaw.
Okay. That might go differently than Neanderthal.
Let's go back. So do you think that geniuses are, it's a loaded question, you think they're born or made?
I think the inherent capacity to exhibit genius is really in everyone, but I do think the expression of that genius is a product of our environment, and I'd say, I'm almost certain that's the case.
That is so funny. I feel very strongly, much in the same way.
Yeah.
And I had no idea how you were going to respond to that question. I think and I'm curious to hear the foundation for your reasoning, because I imagine it's probably different from mine. I'm drawing, of course, from a book, a book called Raise a Genius. Mm-hmm. I think that's literally the name. It might have an exclamation point on the end of it. but it's by this Hungarian psychiatrist or psychologist or something like that. Anyways, his claim to fame is that he believed in his heart that you could raise a genius, and he felt so strongly about this that he raised his 3 daughters to be quote-unquote geniuses. Now, yes, there are perhaps tests, like an IQ test. Maybe, you score above 140 and you can get your little Mensa certificate and be like, I'm a quote-unquote genius. But I liked his approach better. He was like, I'm going to raise them to be absolutely world-class at something, best in the world. And are you familiar with all this stuff already?
Yeah.
You've heard of it.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so he raised 3. I think that they may have all been grandmasters. Definitely, I know one of them was like reached like the tip top of chess playing. And so he felt very strongly that it was all about cultivating the circumstances for them to express their genius. So it's environmental design.
Yeah.
And he designed these environments, and sure enough, they over-indexed. They had outsized results. But I want to hear more about what your reasoning and logic.
Yeah, so I think mine is pretty simplistic here. What defines intelligence?
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah, especially because I feel like with my work and what I do, we are literally trying to quantify intelligence in our candidates, right? Because we help companies hire better, and that means we need to know their reasoning ability, their spatial reasoning ability, their numerical reasoning ability, and their verbal, and comprehension.
But in life, I think that is too much effort, right? It might be too much effort.
Right, for most scientists.
I think it boils down to the conditions. So every single biological life form on the planet is only in existence because the conditions support its existence. Right? There's been, 4 or 5 extinction events, something like that? There's only 1% of all species that ever lived currently living right now.
Oh, I did not know that. That's interesting.
Yeah. And so that's only because the conditions allow it to be so. To me, intelligence is, let's say, a human being, right? If we're going to stay there.
Sure.
A human being's ability to survive in the most adverse conditions and thrive, and in some cases, because we're conscious, cultivate or move into new conditions, right? That, to me, that is like genius, where you've got these kids that come from areas of the world or in the country, and their conditions are just terrible. It's like, how are they even alive?
Right.
And then they go on to be like billionaires, or they go on to like do like really profound humanitarian work. And it's like, and then we go down the street, and then there's this kid that has got the basic suburban life, and parents' household is earning above $150,000, and they've got, for all intents and purposes, the most advantageous lifestyle.
Yeah.
And yet they're not really showing that inherent intelligence that is in them, right? So I think if I had to define genius, it would just be a person's ability to adapt to conditions and then thrive in conditions that are just inhabitable for most.
I think that makes so much sense. So it makes me think of generational wealth too, right? If our criteria for intelligence or genius is the ability to adapt and thrive
Yeah.
in an environment, and we live in, by and large, a capitalist economy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we kind of measure that in terms of wealth, for better or for worse.
Mm-hmm.
Yet we see that usually, I forget exactly what the statistics are, but by the third generation, I think that the generational wealth has been squandered to a large degree, right?
Mm-hmm.
It has not been leveraged and grown. And this is a predictable trend that we've seen play out. And so if there are many people that are going to argue that intelligence, it has a genetic component, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think that discounts and discredits the fact that you are very likely to create a similar environment for your children as your parents created for you.
Right.
And those circumstances had a hand in the expression of your intelligence or your genius or lack thereof that may have been latent, dormant inside you. And I honestly love your perspective that we all have that ability. I think that is so true.
Mm-hmm.
It's really it's an inherent functionality that we all have. It's just seldom expressed, and that's probably why we call it genius. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I do. I agree. We all have it, because if you think about, like, I'll go back to, the conditions on the earth. I mean, you think about almost 4 billion years ago, maybe a little bit sooner than that, the single-celled organism, right, that somehow was able to adapt in its environment to multiply, right? To divide itself, multiply, divide itself, multiply. So that is inherently in all of us. It took, 4 billion years for it to develop into the consciousness that we know, the awareness that we have, and that makes us the most intelligent beings to date on the planet. And so I think that is when we do away with, or when we remove all of the assumptions, all of the, everything that the beliefs, everything that we think we know, and we approach a situation with pure adaptability in mind. We get back to the base, the core structure of what we are, which is supreme adaptability wrapped in consciousness, then that's true genius. I think that you see it all the time. You see these people that they just do something and you're like, man, how did they? Well, it's because they're in these conditions and they tapped into something that is just like inherently at our core.
I feel like I have to ask this question.
Yeah.
And I'm especially interested in asking you in particular, of all people, because you are such a keen observer of your environment. If you had to begin studying the conditions that produce genius in human beings, where would you start? Not asking for a definitive answer, but where would you start your research?
I'd start myself.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
But with the masses.
Yeah, I would probably go back. Thanks for putting me on the spot here.
Sorry,
but,
I always do this to you.
I would probably, like I said, I would look at our path here. I mean,
like evolutionarily.
yeah. I mean, I would
okay.
look at, like I was saying, like Luca, right? The single-celled organism that is attributed with, being the first life form.
It has a name.
Yeah,
And it's Luca.
Luca.
What a cool name.
Yeah. Don't quote me on that. But yes, and the conditions on Earth were, sustainable for that, right? And like I said, I just think that will to adapt, that will to grow is inherent in us. And when we do it at such a proficient rate, it is always the same tree or the same challenge. It's just a new approach. I mean, Luca did it with a sledgehammer. but we're doing it with a laser. No,
Right.
the tree is cutting itself down now, right? And so in terms of our adaptability
Right.
as a species, right? So, or as a being. And so that's what I'm saying. I think the question is, how do we cultivate conditions and find the awareness in us or in a person, help them find it, where they can effectively speed up time or make time move a little bit slower relative to the challenge that they're trying to accomplish. How do they chop that tree down without decades, without centuries of effort, right? And those people that accelerate that, those are the geniuses.
Right.
But they're not much different from you or I. Like they just were put in a set of conditions. They were able to observe an iterative process, the same process that we're all iterating in and with, which is our existence. And then they were able to use their observations and innovate.
Beautifully said. So I think it's about time for us to wrap up. I'm going to share a couple ideas. I want to hear your thoughts and feedback on them, and then we'll tie a bow on this. Go about our merry ways.
All right.
First thing is a Harry Potter quote. And
Nice.
I love the scene where he's like, "Don't forget, every great wizard started out as nothing more than exactly what we are today, students." You know, so potential is infinite, right? And I like to keep that in mind. Second point, or actually maybe the first point, any overused strength can become a weakness.
Mm-hmm.
I find this idea so fascinating, especially because I work in a field where I really encourage people to double down on their strengths.
Mm-hmm.
You know, stop working so hard to become well-rounded and become exceptional at your craft,
Mm-hmm.
right? I give that advice all the time. But I think like our intelligence, our innovation, you know, like I think about cattle production and raising for the purpose of like consuming meat, right? It produces a massive amount of methane in our atmosphere. So it's like we're adapting, you know, but we're kind of adapting ourselves out of a long-term primary objective, staying alive, right? Having a habitable earth. And then the last thing, and you can weigh in on any of these or none of them, it's totally fine, but connectedness as an adaptation.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think it's so funny how like wolves were, I don't know if they're apex predators. I imagine they're probably apex predators, or at least pretty darn close. And they're fearsome and determined and strategic and just all these really cool things. Yet they have, by and large, they've selected out, you know. And dogs, they're fluffy, compassionate, needy ancestors that really value connectedness and belonging. They have selected in. You know, their numbers have risen dramatically. And I think of, you know, our like earlier humanoid ancestors, like Homo erectus, which is maybe one of the bigger ones, but was around for a lot longer than Homo sapiens, you know, and they were fierce and they were brutal and they were strong. They were more robust physically than we are today. But we have adapted. We've formed communities. They were in really small groups. We leverage these interconnected webs of relationships where we can help each other. So while like on a solo basis, we're less fearsome, maybe less threatening, collectively, we have created a dynamic where we are now the apex predator.
Right.
Any thoughts on any of those? Anything stick out to you? That ended up being more than I thought it would be.
I just think, you know, dogs, they figured out that we thrive on reciprocity. So they give us something and we give them something. And whereas wolves, they just didn't figure that out. You know, the earlier, Homo erectus, right? I got that right?
Yeah.
They didn't really understand or maybe they couldn't comprehend the importance of numbers.
Right.
Right? Of populace, right? And we did. and we began to multiply. They were still dividing to multiply
Right.
until there was nothing left. So, I think I'll go back to this. It all requires, in my opinion, the same level of effort. It's just applied differently.
Right.
That dog has to, display reciprocity at the same amount of effort that the wolf has to display aggression.
Right.
It just looks different.
It looks different. And
Yeah.
I think that's with Homo erectus or just other earlier, human-like creatures, that the emotional intelligence was the missing ingredient.
There we go.
They had these prominent eyebrow bones. Like, it's hard to read them.
Right.
We're very demonstrative and expressive, I have a good idea of what you're feeling, and vice versa. And so we can develop trust, which might be one of the most powerful forces on Earth. It's probably a good note for us to end on. Josiah, thank you for your insight and your wisdom and just going with me on this wild ride. And to our listeners, thank you for listening, and we will catch you next time.
Bye, everyone. The Enzo Project is brought to you by Bold Human Capital and Noon Holdings. Edited by ELE. You can find the Enzo Project on Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Music, the song Full Bloom by Jewel and Nua Mina. You can find them wherever you listen to your music.